All right, tonight on Skeptical Inquirer Presents, we are excited to present Dr. Peter J. Hotez. He's the Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics and Molecular Virology and Microbiology at the Baylor College of Medicine, where he is also the co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development and Texas Children's Hospital Endowed Chair of Tropical Pediatrics. In 2022, Dr. Hotez and his colleague, Dr. Maria Elena Bottazzi, were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for developing a low-cost COVID-19 vaccine. And last year, he was called a science warrior as part of Time magazine's list of the most influential people in health. Some of his many books include Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism and Preventing the Next Pandemic, and The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, which I have right here. And coming out in September, he has a new book co-authored with climatologist Michael Mann titled Science Under Siege: How to Fight the 5 Most Powerful Forces That Threaten Our World. I just pre-ordered this book today, and you can too. Now, the Senate just voted to approve Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, despite his decades-long campaign to spread dangerous misinformation about health and especially about vaccines. We need scientists and science communicators like Dr. Hotez now more than ever, and so I'm delighted to introduce science warrior, Dr. Peter J. Hotez.
Well, Steve, thanks so much for having me, and I'm thrilled to be here. And thank you, by the way, for everything you're doing for promoting science and raising awareness and improving science literacy across the country and globally. And we need you times 1,000. That's the only problem. So, we'll start here tonight, and I am deeply grateful for the chance to speak to your audience and speak some more with you.
Yep, thank you, and we're all just very excited to have you.
So I'm going to share my presentation. And I'm always amazed when the technology works.
Me too.
And I hope everybody can see that.
Looks good to me.
And so I'm going to start out a kind of a two-part of this. One, why we're seeing the rise of pandemic threats and tropical infections, the vaccines we're making, but also this counterforce, the title of my previous book is called The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, is interfering with our ability to fight the next generation of pandemics. So I'm going to start here, actually. I was sorry about that. Can everybody hear me? There. I'm going to start here and talk a little bit about one of the most common questions I'm often asked when I go on the cable news channels, which goes something like this. Literally, the question is, what the heck is going on? That's the question. Now, you kind of want to take some time to sort out what do people mean by that, and it turns out what they're really asking is, why now? Why are we seeing this regular cadence, this regular sequence of pandemics and pandemic threats? And I benchmarked the beginning to SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, in 2002. And then from then on, every couple of years, we've had major pandemic threats. We had H1N1 in 2009. Then, if you remember, Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome in 2012. The original SARS in 2002 came out of southern China and hit Toronto, and then Ebola in 2014 out of West Africa, which also affected Dallas, Texas, and I got involved with that. Zika in 2016, Ebola again in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo in 2019, then SARS-2, the mother of them all, and causing COVID-19. Now we've got H5N1 across many parts of the United States, in cattle and birds, and unfortunately people. And many of us are predicting a third major SARS virus coming in the coming years, because we've had SARS-1, SARS-2, now SARS-3 will likely emerge. And the other is Those are the ones that are better known. There's also what's going on is kind of under the radar screen, but very obvious here where I am in Texas and the U.S. Gulf Coast. This rise of tropical infections, many of which are transmitted by mosquito-borne viruses, such as Aedes aegypti. That's what the abbreviation there on the bottom is. And the bottom is not from me. It's a map generated by a colleague of mine, Simon Hay, at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which is where we're expecting the Aedes aegypti mosquito to start flourishing. It's already here, but it's going to expand in Florida, Texas, all along the Gulf Coast. And that Aedes aegypti mosquito is important because it transmits dengue and chikungunya and Zika virus infection, also yellow fever. So all of these are coming back in addition to malaria now in South Texas and South Florida, leishmaniasis and hookworm. So what the heck is going on? And I had written about this in a previous book called "Preventing the Next Pandemic." The publisher didn't like me to use the title "What the heck is going on," so he called it "Preventing the Next Pandemic." But you get the idea. And what it is it's a constellation of forces, and climate change is a big one. But it turns out it's not climate change acting in isolation. It's working in concert with other 21st century forces, and I'll explain why in a minute. Urbanization's a big one, together with deforestation, poverty, and rising anti-science sentiment, which I'll finish talking about, which prevents us from intervening in a meaningful way. So let's look at climate change first. I know you've had Michael Mann on before, and he's been an inspiration for me, and I was so thrilled to co-write the book with him. Michael, as you know, is one of the discoverers of the hockey stick, where you lay a hockey stick on the ground and the blade facing up represents the last 100, 200 years after 1,000 years of more or less steady temperatures, such that we're getting now 50 degrees Celsius temperatures arising in Mexico and on the Arabian Peninsula, and in India and parts of Africa and elsewhere, so much so that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, doesn't even bother calling it global warming anymore. He's calling it global boiling. Now, you might ask, well, what does that have to do with pandemic threats? Well, a couple of things. One, the mosquito-borne viruses and related arthropod-borne pathogens that we're finding are accelerating on the Gulf Coast in Texas because those hot temperatures are continuing now where I am well into November, even December, so longer mosquito vector-borne season. Also, viruses develop faster there. Also, the altered rainfall patterns and flooding, that's a contributory factor. But it's not only the tropical infections, because viruses like SARS or SARS-2, as well as Ebola viruses and other filoviruses, are viruses of bats. And with the altered temperatures, we're seeing bats now seek new food habitats, and they're coming into closer contact with people, closer to human settlements, either infecting humans directly or through second intermediate animal hosts. But the other thing that's happening is not just the bats coming closer to the people, it's the people coming closer to the bats because of expanding urbanization. So now, for the first time in human history, more people live in urban environments and rural environments, but they're expanding not homogeneously, but in clusters, in what we call megacities of 10 million people or more. And for 100 years, the megacities have been in places like New York, London, and Tokyo. Now they're mostly expanding in low and middle income countries. So the estimates are more than 40 new megacities by the end of this decade. And they're in Lagos in Nigeria, and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and in Kinshasa in DR and Democratic Republic of Congo. Of course, on the Indian continent with Delhi and Calcutta, and then Dhaka and Bangladesh, but also in Latin America with Mexico City and Lima and Bogota. And what's happening is they're outstripping urban infrastructures for sanitation, for food security, and they're really hot and sweltering megacities. So that's kind of the apocalyptic vision of the world as our human populations coalesce in these hot and sweltering megacities and become highly susceptible to pandemic threats and tropical infections. And by the way, speaking of hot and sweltering megacities, where I am in the Texas Triangle, the triangle being Dallas, Fort Worth at the top of the triangle, Houston to the right of the triangle, and San Antonio and Austin at the left. These are unfortunately going to be ground zero for a lot of these tropical infections and pandemic threats, and it's the reason why we established our National School of Tropical Medicine in the Texas Medical Center. Now, this is going to require multiple interventions, but one of the things that we're really focused on, where my passion is developing new generation vaccines for these diseases. So we set up in the Texas Medical Center. That's an aerial photo of the right. I took it myself flying into Houston on a Southwest Airlines flight into Hobby Airport. It's, we do everything big in Texas. It's the world's largest medical center. It's a medical city of 120,000 employees and 60 institutions, the MD Anderson Cancer Center and Baylor College of Medicine, Texas Children's Hospital, largest cancer center. And I went there for a specific purpose, to set up a school of tropical medicine, but also to have this life science cluster be a place where we can make the vaccines that no one else will make. Vaccines for diseases that only occur among the world's poorest people. And you might say, well, why is that an issue? Well, the problem is the big pharma companies do make a lot of vaccines for global health, but they operate on a tiered pricing structure, whereas they'll make vaccines that they'll sell at full price to places like the US and Canada and Europe and Japan, and then a tiered pricing for low and middle income countries. But what do you do for vaccines for a disease that only occurs in low and middle income countries? And that's the aspirational goal. So we've been making vaccines for hookworm anemia and schistosomiasis and malaria and Chagas disease. And then, interestingly, we got approached by a group at the New York Blood Center more than a decade ago, which kind of said, hey, Peter, just like nobody cares about your parasitic disease vaccines, no one cares about our coronavirus vaccines for SARS and MERS, and will you work with us? And of course we did. And then when the COVID-19 sequence came online in early 2020, we were able to pivot and make a low-cost COVID vaccine that reached 100 million people with no patents, minimizing strings attached for India and Indonesia. So let me briefly tell you how we do that. We do the cool and cutting-edge innovations like mRNA and lipid nanoparticle vaccines and protein particle vaccines, but we also do this. We try to be compatible with vaccine producers in low and middle income countries. And it turns out there's about 40 of them represented by the blue dots that cluster, and they band together under the banner of DCVMN, the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network. You can go to their website. And they're really interesting organizations, not household names in the United States, but they wind up making a lot of vaccines for low and middle income countries. And one of the most common technologies they use is they make their own recombinant protein hepatitis B vaccine. This is an older technology done through microbial fermentation in yeast. It's been around a few decades. It's a vegan process, actually. No animal cells or human cells or animal proteins, human proteins. There's no limit the amount you can produce. It's extremely low cost, very stable vaccine antigen, so you can keep them at simple refrigeration. You don't need onerous freezer chain requirements. And parents trust it because they've vaccinated their kids already against hepatitis B, so it's a similar technology. So our vision was that we'll make the prototype vaccine using this technology, and then subsequently literally send the prototype via World Courier to the low and middle income country vaccine producers. We'll do the scale up in our Texas Children's Hospital laboratories at the small scale, and they'll do it at the big scale. If you ever visit one of these vaccine producers, it almost looks like going to a brewery because they're big fermentation vessels, a similar technology. And this is co-headed, we're a group of 20 scientists co-headed by myself and my science partner for the last 25 years, Dr. Mary Elena Batazzi. And so these are the diseases we're taking on. On the right is where hookworm and malaria overlap. On the left, where hookworm and schistosomiasis overlap. And I won't go into a detail of the biology of these parasites this evening, but just to show you the maps, because, imagine for a minute that you're the chief executive officer of a of a biotech or a pharma company, this is probably not the map you want in your business plan, right? Because where's your financial return? It's in North America and Europe and Japan. So we're all about not only doing the interesting science, but also trying to find a path to uh, provide access for the world's poorest people, access to these vaccines. And this has been a lifelong quest since I started my MD PhD in New York 40 years ago at Rockefeller University and Cornell. I won't talk about all our vaccines tonight, just to give you a flavor of what we do. So this is our hookworm anemia vaccine. It's a complicated target. It's not a virus or a microbe. It's actually an animal. It's a worm about a centimeter long, a nematode that attaches to the gut and feeds on blood. And children and pregnant women tend to be the most vulnerable. And it's the leading cause of anemia in low and middle income countries. And what I'm showing you here is a colleague of mine is a gastroenterologist in Hyderabad, India, who has patients doing endoscopy, and many of them have hookworms. And so here's an adult hookworm. That pool of blood is the worm injecting an anticoagulant that we discovered, a factor 10A inhibitor, and then the blood courses through the body of the worm. The worm's ingesting the blood and causing blood loss. That barber pole-like effect is because of the white part of the worm's reproductive organs, and then the red is the blood coursing through. So the worm is interested, the hookworm is interested in the hemoglobin inside red blood cells. That's its nutrient source. So when I was an MD PhD student in New York at Rockefeller University, that's a picture of Rockefeller Theobald Smith Hall, with my principal investigator advisor, Anthony Cerami, we wrote about the opportunity to clone and express hookworm antigens as vaccines. This was when the science of molecular biology was very new, and we were among the first to clone and express hookworm genes. And over the years, I worked in my laboratory to dissect out the mechanism by which hookworms feed on blood. And what I'm showing you is a cartoon. The worm is ingesting the red blood cells. And then if you blow up a cross section of the gut, there's these enzymes involved in hemoglobin digestion. And we had discovered a number of them. And it turns out the one that was that worked as the best vaccine antigen in our laboratory was this GST protein that's involved in heme detoxification. And Toya Nasojo in our group solved the X-ray crystal structure. And we were able to show in a series of clinical trials, initially supported by the Gates Foundation, then the Dutch government, that the vaccines that we were making were safe and immunogenic. And then we had to show that they actually worked. And for that, two colleagues of mine, Jeff Bethany and David Demert, worked out a human challenge model and were able to show that by infecting human volunteers, the vaccine was protecting almost 100%, which was extremely exciting. The problem that we face now, though, is even though we've de-risked the investment, we still have to come up with someone who's going to help us with the industrial scale production and distribution and the final clinical testing. And that turns out is the most expensive part. So in a minute, I'm going to tell you about our COVID-19 vaccine and how we were able to do that and reach 100 million people. But the point is that we were able to do that because it was COVID, and the Indian government guaranteed the advanced purchase of our vaccine technology. Same with Indonesia, not for us, but for the vaccine producer, because it was COVID, whereas hookworm anemia is more of a chronic and debilitating infection. And so I'm spending a lot of time going to India, talking to government officials in Delhi, going to Hyderabad, where a biological our vaccine producer was for COVID, to see, what is the secret sauce to get this scale up and made, and also the World Health Organization and the National Institutes of Health, et cetera. Now, for COVID, it was a somewhat different problem. We had developed a vaccine using a similar technology for COVID because we had, as I mentioned, we had been working on SARS and MERS vaccines for so long. And if you remember, the mRNA COVID vaccines were rolled out in the United States at the end of 2020, and by 2021, anyone who wanted to get a COVID vaccine in the United States or Canada or Western Europe could. But this is what the rest of the world looked like by the middle of 2021. This is a map of the unvaccinated population where the bigger the bubble, the lower the percentage of people are getting vaccinated. And what we and this was a terrible tragedy because so many people were losing their lives on the African continent, India and Pakistan, and Indonesia. And we were starting getting frantic calls from ministers of health and ministers of science from these countries. Could we help them? This is actually a map from the Institute for Health Metrics of the deaths from COVID. And you can see they pretty much mirror where people were not getting vaccinated, nobody getting vaccinated in Africa, the highest death rate in Africa. Similarly, in South Asia or Southeast Asia. So this was a desperate humanitarian situation. And we decided to step up, working with Baylor College of Medicine, and transferred our technology with no strings attached. And our vaccine technology led to Corbevax, and it's called Corbevax because biologically was the big vaccine producer. And 75 million adolescent kids got this for their primary immunization to prevent them from hospitalization, and long COVID, and the other consequences of the virus. Another 20 million adults got immunized. So we provided proof of concept that we don't need to be a big pharma company to still do big things in the vaccine space. So this is what I was doing in 2020. If you want to work with countries in Asia and Africa, after sending the prototype, you have to get up pretty early in the morning to get to them by close of business their time. So we were getting up at 4 or 5 a.m. to have discussions with their scientists via Zoom. And also, if you remember, I was talking late into the night on the cable news channels to Don Lemon on CNN and Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC. So I didn't sleep for 3 years, but we were able to do this. And we transferred the ownership, let them work out the clinical trials with their regulators in India. The equivalent of the FDA is called the DCGI, work out how to do the clinical trials and the approval with WHO. We showed the level of virus neutralizing antibody right up there with mRNA vaccines, but it's simpler, low cost, $2 to $3 recombinant protein vaccine, and then step-down studies in kids. And by this time, 3 years ago, 75 million adolescents were immunized. That was very moving, and all the adults. And then we did something similar with Indonesia, a similar vaccine. What was interesting when we worked with the Indonesians was, since it was a vegan technology, they came into our labs to certify that based on the source reagent of everything in their lab. And when they did that, they were able to work with their clergy, because Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority country, and it got certified as halal. So this became the first halal COVID vaccine. So it's kind of interesting, as you go to scale, things start to happen that you never would have thought of otherwise. Now, that's the good news part of the story. The problem is, with all the social disruptions from COVID, we are now having some difficulty getting back on track and vaccinating the world's children. And these are some SOS messages from the World Health Organization that global vaccinations have stalled. And I like to say it's a picture of me in the monk painting over there. And what's going on, I think, though, is not just the social disruptions. I think what's happening now is a globalization of the anti-vaccine movement coming out of the United States. And what I want to do is switch gears and tell you, from having a personal perspective and being kind of a major target of the anti-vaccine movement, how I see this movement unfolding. So just to refresh your memory, I did my MD and PhD in New York City at Cornell and Rockefeller back in the 1980s, and wanted to make vaccines for the world. And that's the plan. And it was deliberate and strategic. And I've had this wonderful life in science making low-cost vaccines for the world. That was the planned part. But the unplanned part was having 4 adult kids, including Rachel, who has autism and intellectual disabilities. And if you remember, the original assertion against vaccines were false claims that vaccines cause autism. And I wound up writing the book, Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, which wound up making me public enemy number 1 or 2 with anti-vaccine groups. I think our good friend Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on his Instagram publicly labeled me the OG villain a few years ago. And I'm so old and square, I had to Google what that means, the original gangster villain. So, Steve, thanks for inviting the original gangster villain. But it gave me this opportunity to have a front row seat to the anti-vaccine movement. And I'd like to share that with you because I think, the how it all unfolded is a bit unclear to people. And of course, there's a massive amount of disinformation in the press. So and this is what's happened over the last, since 1998, almost 30 years of the evolution or de-evolution of the anti-vaccine movement to become its own empire ecosystem. So I'll start with version 1.0 that began in 1998 with a paper that was ultimately retracted, claiming that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine had the ability to, the live virus in that vaccine replicated in the colon of kids, and that somehow led to what that time was called pervasive developmental disorder or autism. And that thread still continues to exist, this false link between vaccines and autism. I'll start there. Then tell you about a decade ago, it became more of a political enterprise around this banner of health freedom, medical freedom, and now how it's globalizing and moving into other spheres of anti-science, which is how I wound up connecting up with Michael Mann, seeing the confluence of attacks on biomedical science with climate science. So here's version 1.0. Within the idea that vaccines cause autism, one of the things the anti-vaccine groups do is they're monetizing the internet. They're selling phony autism cures, or they're attached to the wellness industry and selling nutritional supplements that no one needs, or they're selling books on Amazon. If you go to Amazon.com and type in the word vaccinations, the top 30 plus books are all anti-vaccine conspiracy books. So let me tell you how that began. And on the left, so that's what I mean by the first concept I want to tell you about is this concept of moving the goalposts, whereby anti-vaccine groups make an assertion, they make a specific claim about a vaccine, and then the scientific community debunks it, and then they move the goalpost, or they come up with something else. Another metaphor you could use is whack-a-mole. You knock one down, they come up with another one. So the original assertion were false claims that it was the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, the live virus. They said it was replicating in the colon, and some magically that was leading to autism. That not only was the paper shown not to be true and retracted, but the scientific community responded with large studies, epidemiologic studies with thousands of kids, showing kids who got the MMR vaccine were no more likely to acquire autism than kids who didn't. And that should have been the end of it. And it started in 1998, but by 2005, then Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wrote a paper in Rolling Stone and published simultaneously in Salon magazine saying, okay, it's not the MMR vaccine, it's the thimerosal preservative that used to be in vaccine. Same thing, it was debunked by large-scale epidemiologic studies, also non-human primate studies, but then they came up with something else. And they said it was spacing vaccines too close together. Then it was alum in vaccines. So it became this kind of exhausting exercise. And then they pivoted to the HPV vaccine for cervical cancer and other cancers, saying it's causing infertility or autoimmunity. And if that sounds familiar for COVID-19 vaccines, that's where they got it. They copy-pasted the false assertion from HPV onto COVID. And now they're moving towards something called chronic illness, which is so vague, and they can make it up whatever they want it to be when they, wake up in the morning, that it gets more complicated to debunk. And that's how I got involved. That's a picture of Rachel when she was a little girl. Now she's an adult, and I wrote the book that details the evidence showing there's no link between vaccines and autism. But even that wasn't enough just to show that data, because parents would rightly say, okay, doc, I get it. It's not the vaccines, but what does cause autism? And the answer is we have autism genes involved in neurodevelopment. 100 of them have been identified so far, a lot of them by the Broad Institute at Harvard, MIT. And we actually did whole exome genomic sequencing on Rachel and my wife Ann and I. We found Rachel's autism gene, which is similar to the others. It's involved in neuronal synaptic connections, which makes a lot more sense. In Rachel's case, it was a neuronal cytoskeleton gene, which a number of them are as well. And I detailed that. And now, and after the book got published, We have even more information from the group at Stanford Medical School, Sergio Pasca's group, using brain assembloids or organoids, really mini brains in the test tube using neurons that contain autism genes, showing aberrant migratory patterns. So, clearly autism is something that begins in early fetal brain development, well before birth. And I think we had some luck kind of taking the wind out of the sails of anti-vaccine groups because of that, but they managed to reinvent themselves. And like so many trends, it started in California and amplified in Texas. So this gets us to version 2.0 under this banner of health freedom, medical freedom. So what happened is by the 2010s, so many kids were not getting vaccinated in California because parents were spooked that the idea that vaccines can cause autism, that you started to see clusterings of unvaccinated kids. And the spark that creates an epidemic, often in this instance, like what's happening right now in West Texas, in Texas where I am, are measles epidemics, because measles is the most highly transmissible virus we know. So in 2014, 2015, there was a large measles epidemic in Southern California, in Orange County, and up in Marin County. And the California legislature responded appropriately. They shut down vaccine exemptions. They said, from now on, you want to send your kids to school, your kids have to be vaccinated. And I supported that, and it solved the measles problem. But it also produced a backlash in some states, especially my state of Texas, where it became a political enterprise linked to the Republican Tea Party in Texas. And you started to see these banners of health freedom, medical freedom. In Texas, they formed a political action committee, a PAC that raised money for candidates to run on anti-vaccine platforms that were pushing anti-vaccine legislation. Our good friend Alex Jones, the podcaster in Austin, Texas, weighed in. You started to get this whole ecosystem, and the consequence was we saw a steep rise in the number of parents requesting non-medical exemptions for vaccines, over 100,000. And this doesn't even incorporate all the homeschooled kids that we have in Texas. So Texas became kind of an epicenter of the anti-vaccine movement in America. And that's what came off the rails during COVID-19. This is an article I wrote in the Public Library of Science plus Global Public Health. And I call it the Great Texas COVID Tragedy because it looks at the 100,000 Texans in my state who died because of COVID, of which half of them died needlessly because they refused COVID vaccines. They were victims of this politically motivated health freedom attack. So, and this is what I talk about in the book, The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science. So let me just take you through this very quickly. This is year 2020, 2021, 2022. These are daily deaths. This is the shape of the curve will look familiar to many viewers in the U.S. because it's has some similarities in other parts of the country. This is the first wave of COVID deaths that hit Texas in the summer of 2020. It hit the Northeast a little bit earlier in the spring of 2020 with the original lineage. This is the alpha wave in that horrible winter of 2021. There's the Delta wave that began in the summer of 2021, and here's the BA1 Omicron wave. And this big green arrow represents a time, and it's probably, you could even move it to the left a little bit, the time when mRNA COVID vaccines became freely and widely available. Any Texan who wanted to get a vaccine could. But you see that the deaths are almost as great before the green arrow as after the green arrow, and that's because so many Texans refused to take a COVID vaccine. So of the 100,000 deaths, roughly 40 to 50,000 did not have to occur because Texans refused to get vaccinated. And so it was really a horrific tragedy watching this unfold. Let me give you a comparison. The nation of Canada, which has a population about the same size of Texas, 30 plus million, similar trillion-dollar economy, admittedly over a larger geographic area. In Canada, there were 50,000 deaths as opposed to 100,000 deaths. Why? Because after their green arrow, Canadians agreed to get vaccinated, and the deaths halted. In Texas, they kept on going through because of vaccine refusal. And in the book, I do a deep dive looking at the forces that were driving it. And, I benchmarked the CPAC Conference of Conservatives in Dallas in 2021 where in their zeal to push back against vaccine mandates, they falsely discredited the effectiveness and safety of vaccines. They said first they're going to vaccinate, and they said that vaccines were instruments of political control. They said first they're going to vaccinate you, then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles. That was a quote from a member of Congress who came down to Texas for that CPAC conference. And then they brought on all the aggressive and toxic anti-vaccine activists to falsely discredit the effectiveness and safety of vaccines. And then the pile-on came from the House Freedom Caucus in Congress, comparing vaccines to the Holocaust, calling people like me medical brown shirts, horrible stuff, and Senator Ron Johnson holding these phony baloney vaccine injury roundtables. And then the amplification on Fox News, and this was documented by two groups, Media Matters, a watchdog group, as well as a research group out of the Federal University of Science and Technology in Switzerland. Every night during this Delta wave, Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, and Sean Hannity falsely discredited the effectiveness and safety of vaccine. They filled their broadcasts with anti-vaccine content. So, if you were going down that rabbit hole watching Fox News every night, or some of the podcasters who were falsely discrediting vaccines and playing up ivermectin, which has absolutely no effect on COVID-19, no, certainly no beneficial effect, you became a victim of this organized and targeted anti-science campaign. And now we're seeing this continue through this kind of pandemic rhetoric, and you see it coming from a number of podcasters saying either COVID was invented or H5N1 was invented and it was a plot by scientists to disrupt society and all this kind of nonsense. And it's been very, very harmful as well. And so I get pretty heavily targeted because I call it out. I say, no, the anti-vaccine movement is a deadly force and it's politically oriented. So these are some of the nicer things you can find about me on the internet, or, Steve Bannon publicly calling me a criminal and this kind of nonsense. And of course, I get physically stalked. I get emails. Some of the emails are interesting, and I show them not to shock you, but to give you a sense of what we're dealing with here. So this guy here puts it all in the subject line. He writes, "Dear Doctor, I use that term loosely, Hotez. You print one more blog paper suggesting the roundup of free citizens," which of course I don't, but that's, the health freedom propaganda to give an unproven shot, which of course it's not. It is well proven that is no more a vaccine than an M&M is, this craziness. And I'll suggest to my patriot frenzy be hunted. So the army of patriots is coming to hunt me down. And also heavy use of Nazi rhetoric. So I tend to be the trifecta because I'm a scientist, a vaccine scientist, and Jewish vaccine scientist. And so they like to hurl a lot of Nazi images at me. It's gotten very dark. And, there's this idea that now they put up on the internet that there's going to be a military tribunal, something along the lines of the Nuremberg military tribunal, and these kinds of threats. People 75 years ago, people like you were tried, convicted, hung by the neck until dead. There's a lawyers committee right now collecting the names of people to be indicted for Nuremberg crimes. They say this will be Nuremberg 2. You'll see that written off. And I'm turning your name over to the prosecutor's legal team, the guy who gives me a website to look at, and then he says, "May the force be with you." So I got that going for me. But the consequence now is it's spilling over to childhood vaccines. So we've now got polio detected in the New York State wastewater in 2022. Over the last year, from 2023 to 2024, a five-fold rise in pertussis cases, four-fold rise in reported measles outbreaks. And so I'm doing whatever I can to counter it. This is a new paper in the Public Library of Science, Global Public Health, plus Global Public Health, right? Talk about some steps we need to actively counter the disinformation, which we don't do enough. I have to go on the cable news channels and explain why mRNA COVID vaccines do not cause turbo cancers, that there's no such thing as a turbo cancer, that the mRNA gets into our cytoplasm, but on our nucleus, and we have proteins of our innate immune system that block integration of foreign DNA, that the likelihood of happening next to an oncogene is minuscule. But, I don't have the bandwidth that that's really needed. Or I'll try to show charts like this, showing what happens if 10,000 kids get measles, that 2,000 are hospitalized, 500 get life-threatening measles pneumonia, the deaths, the rates of measles otitis versus the almost zero side effects of the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, MMR vaccine, very rare allergic side effects, or thrombocytopenia. That's no worse than if you get what happens if you get measles. And so what the anti-vaccine groups do is they will play up the very rare side effects without telling you about what really happens if you get the illness. So I think representations like this could be helpful. And then, all the Nazi imagery, these are swastikas that have been sent to my home twice in the shape of syringes or masks, or if you ever follow me on Twitter, and I'm not necessarily encouraging you to go on Twitter, it's become such a cesspool, but you see all of this anti-Semitic stuff that Jews are trying to take over the world through COVID, or they're profiting from vaccines. And of course, we made a low-cost COVID vaccine for the world, or we're creating viruses that goes back to the 1300s when they accused Jews of starting the bubonic plague, or when they called Einstein's theory of relativity the Jewish fraud. And I've actually gotten very interested in this whole link between anti-science and anti-Semitism, which is a dimension we go into a little bit in the new book with Michael, but something I think we could explore more. And not that I deserve the comparison with the Galileo, but at this point I'll take whatever I can get. And just to end by saying, I think this is now globalizing. This is affecting our whole global vaccine ecosystem. I've met with Tedros twice now, Dr. Tedros, the Director General of WHO. We're both concerned that now this anti-vaccine movement is creeping into the African continent and Latin America. And of course, with all of the new appointments and confirmations going on, I'm worried this could even grow and get worse. And of course, the U.S. pulling out of the World Health Organization, which can't possibly be helpful. So, Steve, let me stop there, and I'm kind of in your hands and happy to proceed in any way you'd like.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hotez. Your work is really just truly inspiring, and it does give me hope for the future that we've got people like you working on these issues. And at the same time, I don't know if I should be associating with an OG villain. And honestly, it's just hard to hear about some of the threats that you've been exposed to online. I know one of the emails you shared is also in your book, The Deadly Rise of
Right,
Anti-Science.
right.
I remember, and there's a few others in there as well. And
I mean, it was a hard book to write because it talks about a lot of dark stuff. But my view is you have to sort of lay it out there so people can really understand it, and especially the politics stuff. Talking about far right politics. As a physician or scientist, we're trained not to talk about politics, right? You're supposed to be above it. We're not supposed to talk about Democrats and Republicans and liberals and conservatives and red states and blue states. But as I say, I haven't found a way to talk about it other than to talk about it. So I talk about it, or I write about it. Not that I care about your politics, that's your right as an American citizen, but to say, don't adopt this stuff. How do we uncouple the anti-science from political discourse? And because it's so destructive, and that's a very tough needle to thread, though.
As a relatively new magazine editor, I'm facing that same challenge, is trying to figure out how to talk about science without making it overly political. And appreciate that you've been a trailblazer in this way. What's it been like for you as a person to experience these threats to really your safety and your family's safety?
Well, during the day, I'm in the mix, right? I'm talking to students, I'm in the lab, I'm in lab meetings, I'm talking to smart people like you, and I'm fine. At night, it starts to mess with your head. You wake up in the middle of the night and you say, "My God, what's going on? What's going on? Not only with me personally, but what's going on with the country?" And that's so concerning. And of course, all of the pandemic anti-Semitism stuff is especially troubling. I grew up in West Hartford, Connecticut. Never experienced anything like that, and it's not that it's in Texas; it's nationally. Um, and and I've actually tried to turn it on as a positive and gotten whole interest in this whole nexus between religion and science, and not only the links between anti-science and anti-Semitism, but people who've tried to reconcile all of this. People like the Jesuit paleontologist Taylor Desjardins, who wrestled with the Vatican around evolution and how he came to terms with it. And the concept's a bit half baked. Maybe it'll be a future book one day, but I think religion, ironically, could turn out to be a way to open the door to help heal all of the anti-science aggression.
I think we need all hands on deck in that regard, and that's a great point. I should bring up again that the Senate just voted to approve RFK Jr. as the Secretary of HHS. And since I've got you today, I mean, I just got to ask what you think is the best case scenario over the next few years with him, and what is the worst case scenario?
Well, it isn't only RFK Jr. I mean, that's what gets a lot of media attention, but it's a bigger space. I mean, there's two things going on. One, I do think we'll see declining government support for science, or at least biomedical science. You saw the first round, they tried to massively cut indirect costs from NIH grants, which would make it very hard for medical schools to continue to run scientific operations. And so I had to wind up speaking to our graduate students and postdocs today about how to navigate all that space in declining government science. And then there's going to be a lot of junk science put out there as legitimate, and you're going to see a lot of the wellness influencers, the nutritional supplements industry, which is already a multi-billion-dollar industry, really ascend. So the level of junk science, pseudoscience, is going to be at an all-time high. So no question, we're in for it for a while. And how to navigate that space, how to do it with optimism, and where are the other sources of support for science, and what would be the role now of the biotech sector, for instance. Is it's not going to replace government support, but how to encourage young people to continue getting PhDs and MD PhDs in science, so we don't lose all of our scientists and have a major brain drain. Those are the things that I'm worried about.
Relatedly, with the US pulling out of the World Health Organization, what do you think are some potential consequences of that?
Well, it's a negative. It's bad for the WHO because the US is one of the largest donors to WHO. Anywhere between 10-20% of the funds from WHO come from the USA, so that's going to be hard for them. But it's also hurting the US because it doesn't give the US a seat at the table over information about emerging avian flu virus sequences that are happening now all over the world, and puts us less in touch and makes us more inward looking when these pandemics are accelerating at an unprecedented rate because of climate change and urbanization. So I think that's going to be a really difficult one to punch, and not only that, we're going to see increases because now we're also cutting the USAID budget, and or dissolving USAID potentially in terms of all the people on antiretroviral treatment for PEPFAR. So global AIDS will grow, malaria, or the program I worked on with neglected tropical diseases. So not having that U.S. leadership for global health hurts the WHO, hurts the world, and hurts the U.S. because we won't have that seat at the table. It also provides an opportunity for other global powers, superpowers, to have. I mean, I'm not a political scientist, to have hegemony, right? I mean, China now could really come in a big way and have a lot more influence than they've had previously, and so that worries me.
I was worried when I read just recently about the new measles outbreak in your state of
Mm-hmm.
Texas. Just who should we be most worried about? Is it the little babies that haven't yet been vaccinated? Is it people who are immunocompromised? Like who is most at risk for some of these outbreaks like measles?
Well, the measles vaccine is an old vaccine. It's a very good vaccine developed by someone who passed away a couple of years ago. It was a close friend, Sam Katz. He was chair of pediatrics at Duke University Medical Center forever, together with John Enders, who also won the Nobel Prize for cultivating the cell line for the polio vaccine. And that was done at Boston Children's Hospital. That vaccine, a single dose, 93% effective, two doses, 97%. So it's overwhelmingly the unvaccinated. And in this particular county of West Texas, we've got very low vaccination rates. So the virus just spreads like wildfire. And as I said, we've already had a fourfold rise in measles epidemics over the last year. And historically, by the way, in the pre-vaccine era, when we've had measles epidemics, they would tend to happen late winter, early spring. So, Steve, guess where we're heading pretty soon? Late winter, early spring. So, I'm holding my breath now for the next few weeks that things don't really start to accelerate.
I have just a few questions left. I'm just thinking about people I know who believe in vaccines, but for whatever reason they choose not to get vaccinated. Just perhaps they don't want to experience the pain of the shot, or they're just worried about side effects they might have. Can you just tell us the benefits of herd immunity and why that's important?
Well, for childhood immunizations, herd immunity is very important. And herd immunity never really got achieved for COVID vaccines because of all of the vaccine refusal together with all of the antigenic variation and the variants. So herd immunity doesn't always occur. And when that happens, it's especially important that people get vaccinated because that's the only thing between you and the virus. And as I say, 200,000 Americans died because they didn't accept COVID vaccines. But also remember, it's not just COVID vaccines. For adults, this is a terrible flu season. We've already had 13,000 influenza deaths, and we're only now peaking. So the likelihood is that'll double or maybe triple. We could be looking at 20, 30,000 influenza deaths. People don't understand that influenza is not just a respiratory virus. It causes heart attacks, just like the COVID virus causes heart attacks. And so one of the best ways to protect your heart health is keeping up with your flu and your COVID vaccines. And then there's another vaccine available for RSV, which is extremely important. The problem is the pro-vaccine message is just drowned out by all of the anti-vaccine disinformation. They dominate the internet. They dominate certainly the social media, Twitter and Meta and others. But the anti-vaccine rhetoric being put on the Fox News and the other cable news channels that reach millions of people every night, and all the anti-vaccine stuff on the most highly watched podcasts. This is really tough to go up against. I mean, if I can get the opportunity to speak to people, I can, usually persuade them of the importance of getting vaccinated, but we just don't have the bandwidth. Like, when the Florida Surgeon General Latipo, started talking about turbo cancers and mRNA, and there was silence in response. So I went on cable news channels and explained why turbo cancer is a made-up term and why there's no plausibility for it. And if you happen to watch me on that, you'd probably get it, but it's a small percentage of the U.S. population.
Maybe ending on a positive note, what are some possible solutions for combating science denial?
Well, I think one of the things that I do is when someone openly espouses anti-vaccine, anti-science viewpoints, that my first response is to get upset, right, or even to get angry. And I always check myself. I say, wait a minute, that individual is a victim. That individual's been snookered. That individual has been targeted deliberately by dark forces that are politically motivated, selling crap in the wellness industry. And when you remember that they themselves are victims of it, that can make it easier to really want to convince people of the importance of science. So science denialism is now, in my view, a political force. It's meant to not only as a form of propaganda for political control, but it's also meant to portray the intellectuals, portray the scientists as public enemies or enemies of the state, and just like Stalin did in the 1930s, just like what was done in Weimar Germany. And interestingly, to write the book, I had to learn something about political science. I had to, talk to people like Ruth Ben-Gad at NYU, or read Anne Applebaum, or even Hannah Arendt, and then you start to understand what this is about. This is anti-science is a central platform in autocratic regimes.
All right. Well, any last thoughts you'd like to share with readers of Skeptical Inquirer or other skeptically minded, scientifically minded folk that might be watching tonight?
Well, just that I think, the anti-science ecosystem is expanding, and, it was separate nodes for a while that are beginning to coalesce. You had, around vaccines, and now around the phony baloney around gain of function or lab leak COVID origins, then with the attacks on climate science. And now all of this is starting to coalesce, and it's becoming a really dangerous force in the United States. And, what can I say? What you're doing, Steve, is so important. Because I think what we have to do is begin chipping away at it, and to educating people about the dangers of anti-science, and that's why I feel really blessed to have been able to work with Michael Mann, and I learned so much from him, and it was really interesting how we began to finish each other's sentences, because the same group of, not always, I mean, if you look at the two circles of the Venn diagram, they don't completely overlap, but there's significant overlap between the attacks on climate science and the attacks on biomedicine. And I think it's not stopping there. I think you're going to see this continue in other fields of science as well.
Well, I was certainly excited when I got online today and I was able to find your new book on the bookseller that I use. I saw it doesn't have a cover yet. It says cover coming soon, but it does have a publication date in September. The book is Science Under Siege, and I'll certainly look forward to reading it and encourage everybody else to take a look today and see if you can get your hands on a copy. Thanks so much, Dr. Hotez, for being with us. And just so you know, when I end the talk tonight, it's a heart out on the Zoom as well. So I'm just saying goodbye to you, and I'll
Okay.
send you a thank you email.
By the way, there was I know something fell out of my microphone early on in my talk, and I don't know if you want to edit that out or not. That's up to you.
Oh, okay. I think it
A,
just happened for a second, but I was able to
a
hear
little
almost everything.
a little glitch there.
Okay. Thanks so much, Dr. Hotez. Take
Thank you
care.
again. All the best.
Yep. Bye bye.
Bye bye.